I couldn't have manifested worse relationships and experiences, but it wasn't until I started to unknowingly address my codependency, my low self-worth, my lack of boundaries, my lack of respect for myself, that I started to manifest everything I wanted. From To Be Magnetic, this is the Expanded Podcast with your host, Lacy Phillips. As the leading destination for neural manifestation, we dispel the woo-woo in order to help you create real, tangible results based on neuroplasticity, psychology, epigenetics, and energetics. Our goal is to normalize the practice of manifestation and empower you to get into the driver's seat of your life in order to manifest the experiences, relationships, and things that most align with your authenticity. Part of our manifestation process entails expanding past your limiting subconscious beliefs. Therefore, by tuning into this podcast with interviews from experts, thought leaders, spiritual teachers, scientists, and those with neural manifestation success stories, you're starting the process of expanding your subconscious in order to see to believe that anything you desire is possible. And by pressing play, the process begins.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Expanded. Jessica here. I wanted to pop in before we get into this amazing episode with Dr. Tara, Lacy, and I of Explained to share another My Magnetic story of a member that has gone on to manifest something really profound. So this member, after going through the workshops and setting boundaries and going through Unblock Love, was able to exit a toxic relationship, call in new dating opportunities that were more aligned and healthy, move past codependency and abandonment issues, set boundaries, and she even manifested a great new relationship with her father and a new business opportunity because love and money are so intertwined. This member's story is very in-depth, but I'm only sharing a sneak peek of it that I think is really applicable to the boundaries work that we're all looking at this month. Here goes. To Be Magnetic has entirely transformed my life beyond manifestation. I could write so much more in depth and detail, but here's a taste of what TBM has done for me. I had deep abandonment and codependency issues that led to my last relationship being abusive. My abandonment and codependency issues stem from my absent father. He was building his business and traveled constantly, 2 to 3 weeks at a time. After 2-3 days, I would cry desperately, fearing my father had disappeared and never to come back. I would ask my mom, why did dad leave me? And why was he gone for so long? I had no idea what abandonment or codependency meant. In relationships, every guy cheated on me. I thought it was my fault. So when the last guy I was in a relationship didn't cheat on me, albeit he flirted with other girls, but I chalked it up to him being Italian, I tolerated everything else. It wasn't until I had to have stomach surgery due to ulcers that I realized something didn't add up. That's when I really dove into the To Be Magnetic work. As I did the Unblock Love workshop, I learned the importance of boundaries. It gave me the strength and courage and clarity to leave my toxic relationship and move back to Paris. As I was transitioning between Milan and Paris, being steadfast with my boundaries, it really helped me stay focused and not fall back into the toxic relationship as he tried to convince me to stay. During this time, I was tested several times with men who seemed aligned to my list. Had I not had the workshops, I wouldn't have been able to escape this toxic relationship so easily. After a new first date, there were several red flags, and I was strong enough to say no and goodbye. Although these tests kept popping back up in my life, I continued to say no and know that I deserve so much more. He was actually an expander for me at the same time. I'm thrilled to say I've worked through so much of it now, and even when I see the sparkling, dangling carrot as a test, I joyfully walk away and say no. My question to myself is always, did he expand me, and how? I feel like I'm very close to finding my partner because I continue to meet men who are much more aligned to my list than ever before. Now, this member also went on to set a boundary with her father by telling her that she was selling inventory from her company and making a large career pivot, which seemingly in the past would have been very difficult. He He was extremely proud of her for making the decision. He told her that he respected her. And this was actually the first time she felt she had garnered his respect and felt seen by him in her life. The next day, he called her and gave her a business proposal to join his new venture in a family office. She writes, "I have really felt truly in my power, empowered, and ready for this new opportunity. I've learned grace and to speak my truth authentically, diplomatically, and in kindness and compassion, all of which I never thought could be. I knew deep down, but I never knew how to allow myself to be me while still being seen and heard. I was someone who had a temper, felt entitled, and was angry, and thought that was the only way to be heard. Thank you, TBM. You have given me back to me." I love this member story. You can find it linked in our show notes to the motivation where we share the full version of it. But there's so much growth in the places she was at, and there's such a clear connection between the codependency and enmeshment and boundary issues she was having from her father and looking for validation there to the ones that were coming up in her relationships, and how setting boundaries and really honoring herself and moving herself step by step out of bad situations and more into her worth really helped everything else align without needing to change anyone else, and the world around her changed. And of course, anyone who is experiencing abuse in a relationship, we highly recommend getting outside help from a therapist, counsel, or a special hotline. It's very important to seek out support if you are in that situation and know that you are definitely not alone. If you would like to read more stories like this, head over to the motivation to become expanded.
Welcome back to another Explained episode, which has quickly become your favorite segment of the entire podcast, Expanded. In Explained, Dr. Tara Swart joins my co-host Jessica Gill and I in deep diving on specific themes within manifestation, which all of you love because it's where we bridge our process of manifestation with neuroscience and psychology and the deep science that anchors it all together. Back in July, Dr. Tara Swart joined us as our psychology and neuroscience advisor. And why we handpicked her, besides the fact that she's so unbelievably marvelous, she has a PhD in neuroscience and a former medical career as a psychiatrist of 7 years. She's also a senior lecturer and on faculty at MIT, no big deal, and senior lecturer at King's College. She's currently working on research projects on plasticity and epigenetics. She has Google Talks, LinkedIn, Facebook, and 2 TED Talks. She's also the author of 3 books, her latest being The Source. So let's get into another Explained episode where Dr. Tara and I break down the energetics and science of manifestation, offering a roundtable perspective on the deep intricacies and connection. Here goes.
So I'm going to kick us off with a quote today. Our theme is codependency, which some of you might have heard, use the term, feel like you fall in that category, know someone that falls in that category, but we're really getting to the nitty-gritty of it and the insight to it. So kicking us off with a quote, "How much of your self-worth depends on what other people think of you?" So I did a lot of reading of articles and looking up things online and really trying to understand and boil down codependency. And I got a link to the article below, but I got kind of this like pull out definition of codependency of kind of what I was understanding. But essentially what I was finding was that codependency is a coping mechanism brought on usually by a trauma response of not having your needs met, likely in childhood. It involves reliance on other people for validation, love, self-worth, and the difficulty of attuning and honoring one's own boundaries in the process, while often taking on others' needs or manipulating others to feel secure. This can occur with a parent-child, partner-partner, friend, or even coworker boss. It's a large spectrum and the dynamics change over time. So Lacy, Dr. Tara, how do you sort of define codependency? How do you view codependency, both from the manifestation front and from the neuroscience psychology front? Dr. Tara, I'll kick it off to you first.
Yeah, so I have obviously seen the extremes, having worked on psychiatric wards, and it is a spectrum. So we may all have elements of codependency, but be living a relatively healthy life. But I've seen the extreme, which is I literally can't live without that person. And I wanted to share an example with you that has stayed with me for so many years. I think I was in Bermuda at this point, so it would have been 2007, where I had a woman come onto the ward who tried to hang herself because her relationship had ended. And when her husband came in to visit, in the ward round, he actually said, I now can't be with her because I can't accept that any relationship is so important that you would want to end your life if that relationship wasn't working out. And I thought that was so interesting because it really made me have this glimpse that the relationship may have been salvageable, but this extent of codependency was almost like so repulsive to the person that they couldn't be with that person. So it's essentially about getting all your needs met by this other person because psychologically you've had a difficult or neglectful or abusive parent. And so you've had to work really hard to get their love. And you're kind of used to not getting it. So you may become a carer, or you may become very needy or clingy. You may, have lots of anxiety when you two are actually physically separate. So separation anxiety that starts in childhood is on a spectrum with codependency later in life.
And then, Lacy, how do you see sort of codependency through the manifestation lens?
It's really interesting because I'm a complete codependent. If there's any type of thing I have to work through the most, it's codependency. And I fall in a really interesting place on the spectrum because, growing up, being shuffled from 4 different houses, having very young parents who didn't know how to heal their own intimacy issues, therefore being able to have a deeply intimate connection with me. And then going on to having an alcoholic parent, I have like the full trifecta that creates complete codependency. And then I'm energetically and psychically very, very, very sensitive. So that's something I think, obviously, we don't hear about or know about clinically, but if you are, you're incredibly, incredibly sensitive to every environment, everybody's energy. And for me, I think that all of that combined is what zaps my adrenals the most. That's why I spend a lot of time alone, grounding. So that's one part of the codependency spectrum. But then the coping mechanism that I learned for codependency is both of my parents are avoidance. So I had the lesson that you can just walk away from things easily. You don't need anybody. You're a one-ship force, then nobody can hurt you. So I'm codependent in many ways where I seek approval. I am constantly feeling into psychically and energetically what other people are thinking and feeling. And all of that is affecting me. However, my way to cope with it is that I shut it out and I don't need anything or anyone to survive. So this will be a really interesting conversation because it's the thing I'm still working through the most. Even when I was doing a 12-step program, Al-Anon, in fact, didn't even connect for me as strongly as Coda because my most formative years, my mom didn't start drinking until I was around 11. So I wanted to share that because I think that most people listening in one way or another can probably relate to some aspect of what I just had to say. So this will be quite an interesting episode because it's not something I'm fully healed on, but we can certainly start to move into talking about how it affects the energetics of manifestation and how far I've come in that regard.
Yeah, and you actually raised a really important point from the psychology point of view, which is that codependency is most often associated with being needy and clingy and unable to be alone and having to have a relationship or perhaps tolerating bad things in a relationship. But another part of it is I don't need anyone, I'm completely independent. So it's kind of that black and white or pendulum swing. Whereas what, we ideally want is to be in a relationship of interdependence where you each have your own path, you have your own interests, you don't need validation from each other. But when you come together, you cherish the relationship, you listen to each other, you support each other and can be vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think that that is a really good indication for somebody like myself who's kind of been in recovery with codependency for a long time. When you can reach a healthy space with that, that's when I think the progress, really presents itself, because there was certainly a point, when I refer back to dating, my younger years, and I would say I was a doormat. Those were my codependency issues. They were my people-pleasing issues. It's what I thought love was. It's what I thought intimacy was, which was just obsession and no boundaries, not valuing myself. And it's so interesting now to be in a relationship where I think most of the time we share that together. But it's been fascinating. And I think this is something I do bring up often. Certainly this has been present in pregnancy, that hormones, namely estrogen, can make me very codependent again, very needy, self-doubting, not having a lot of boundaries, needing validation from my partner. But for the most part, we have that interdependence. And I think that that is such a beautiful marker that a lot of progress and healing has taken place in codependency.
I think that's a really important thing to highlight with codependency, though, is that people think of it as like just that clingy thing, or they think about it in, oh, you're just, putting others' needs before yourself. And there's so many different facets and dynamic, but the root is still the same, which is I'm going to sort of change my behavior, not honor my own needs in order to feel love and connection with someone else, even if it means rejecting them first so I don't have to be rejected. And I think that's why it's a bit confusing, because it kind of covers such a massive spectrum. But here are some signs that, activities that you might be doing that might lead to you having some codependent tendencies. Relying on others for self-approval, feeling responsible for others' thoughts, emotions, or actions, struggling to define and maintain personal boundaries, an inability to say no, fear of abandonment, perfectionism, making excessive and non-reciprocated sacrifices on behalf of a relationship, feeling inadequacy, low self-worth, people-pleasing, and sacrificing personal needs to support the perceived desires of others.
I think that's a really good place to actually kind of inject the energetics of codependency and manifestation, because everything you just highlighted is basically our body of work to get people to a place of whole worthiness. And, you think about even me putting together this body of work, which certainly a lot of things we're teaching in here aren't original. I certainly didn't come up with them. They're just tools that we've put together, this entire process and formula to get to a certain energetic state that is what I think of as magnetism. And everything you just highlighted, it is our body of work, from boundaries to inner child to shadow, everything we teach about self-worth. And it's not a coincidence that a codependent formulated and put all of that together. So just letting you guys know, listening, that I think the energetic essence of manifestation, and I think that this is where that conversation, and not to beat this over the head all of the time, but I think it's actually a really problematic place to be, the thinking positive, the high frequency, if you do struggle with any form of codependency or just being a human being, because it doesn't give any space for you to heal those things. So in fact, when I lived in that space, especially I was doing all of my think positive back when I was dating, and I couldn't have manifested worse relationships and experiences, but it wasn't until I started to unknowingly address my codependency, my low self-worth, my lack of boundaries, my lack of respect for myself, that I started to manifest everything I wanted. And I know everybody listening, not everyone sitting there being like, I don't have any boundaries and I have respect for myself. And it's really not about that. It's about, in ratio to what you're calling in, where are the little or big blind spots that still exist that you don't have full deservingness, expansion, and worth in what you're calling in. And so I think this episode, when it comes to manifestation, is really enlightening, because talking about codependency directly correlates energetically to areas that you're calling things in and you're not receiving them. There's an element there that is very similar to the energetics of codependency that are lacking subconsciously, potentially, or just in your conscious behavior. And that can be, imprintation from one memory of abandonment. I remember this was terrible. And I think I talked about this recently, but I went away on my first school camp trip in 6th grade and had been dating. And it was such a codependent situation, such a trauma bond. We were so young. But my boyfriend, quote unquote, that I was dating left me at that camp midway through for another girl. And there was so much shame and everybody made fun of me and etc. That's a great example of how something can be imprinted traumatically, subconsciously, somatically, that's still playing out and affecting someone and being able to manifest love or money. So I think this episode is, even if you don't identify as a codependent, is actually going to be really insightful based on where you're manifesting in your life, that you have the energetics of this behavior subconsciously or consciously.
I was just going to present the other side of the coin because I think it's really interesting to see how the characteristics of an interdependent relationship align so nicely to the work as well. So the top one is healthy boundaries, and there's actually, unblocked boundaries. Active listening, which is both you listening and feeling listened to. Time for individual personal interests, which, if you were in a codependent relationship, would you take the time to do DIs every day? You might think that was being selfish, or you might miss out on something. Clear communication, taking personal responsibility for behaviors, so not blaming others, creating safe spaces to be vulnerable, engaging and responding in your relationships, having healthy self-esteem, and being open and approachable, even with sort of difficult issues. So I see those, whereas where Lacy was saying how the characteristics of a codependent relationship can impact your manifestation negatively, I think we can also see how these things can impact it positively.
Absolutely. And that's where we're trying to arrive to. May we fall on the spectrum of codependency or not? That is magnetism.
And I think, too, we have an article on the blog on this, but about codependency and manifestations. And it brought up some great points in there when it relates back to manifestations, because when you're playing out a codependent dynamic, whether it's with a friend or with someone, it could even be you can have a codependent relationship with like your own business experience, with your career, and relying on that in sort of an unhealthy way. You're putting your worth into something else that's outside of you, communicating low self-worth, which we know doesn't help you align with your manifestations because you're saying you're not worthy of that thing. But oftentimes in these dynamics, you might not even be calling in what you're desiring, because you're calling in what you think other people will give you validation and love and acceptance if you had. So if you really get to your authentic code and look at, is this even aligned with me? Who am I separate from what the world is programming me to think I should be? And then the other piece is that, your worth is based on others' perceptions. So just to give a concrete example, like let's say you're dating someone and you really need them to be into you, and then all of a sudden you feel confident, you could take on the world, things feel easy breezy, like you're just in a flow state. Well, you're only in that flow state because you got validation from that partner. Let's say that partner's having an off day or a bad day and you're not perceiving you're getting that same validation from them. Now your self-worth may plummet or go lower, or you might not feel as confident. And because you are plugged into that external validation, would that also mean, and Lacy, I'm curious your take on this, like, would that also mean then the manifestations are connected to the self-worth, which is connected to the other person?
Absolutely. And I hate saying this because there's a lot of backlash in society always these days. But also my job here is to be very clear about energetics. So one thing I can read, see, know, understand. Honestly, it's the first thing you learn in any book of shadow that you're reading, like the Light Chasers book. When you unplug out of anything else validating you and you plug that back into yourself. And one of the greatest ways to do that is integrating a shadow that's coming up, a trigger, activation, that is instantly going to put you into magnetism. And so that's where, weirdly, my avoidant tendencies help me be very magnetic. And I think a lot of people can identify with that. I think we all have strengths and weaknesses that we naturally walk with right now that help with manifestation through this lens of neural manifestation. And one of mine is being an avoidant. How easy is it for me to walk away from something, to jump off of a cliff, to say no in a different capacity than what boundaries are, saying no to an offer that I don't totally align with, so that's where qualities of avoidance really come in and help me with magnetism. Whereas somebody else who maybe grew up extremely expanded in life from their community, caretakers, media, just the life they grew up in, that could be one of their elements that's a strength of manifestation that allows things to come a little bit easier to them. But yeah, to answer the question, the more we can unplug, and I don't mean this in an unhealthy avoidant way, I mean it more in a healthy, interdependent way that you were mentioning, Dr. Tara, the more that we can unplug any type of validation need, anything like that, out of anything else. So I'm not just talking about a relationship or a person or a job or a friendship, but anything, and plug it back into ourself, to our true authenticity. Again, doing that DI, the authentic self, like understanding your true authentic self, your authentic code, operating from that place, that is going to help us manifest so quickly.
And this is one thing that often comes up a lot, and I think it's really important to mention here too, is that one of the ways that codependency can present is hypervigilance. When you're so in tuned with someone else's emotional state that you think you're perceiving them to feel uncomfortable or upset, or you're like, oh no, like I'm picking up on these mild cues that this person is not liking me or not liking the situation and I need to do something to fix it. And picking up on those subtle cues can also be considered being an empath, because you're picking up on others' emotions, you can feel the vibes, all of these things. And so I think there's an interesting line with people glorifying being an empath and actually perhaps maybe not having good boundaries or leaning into codependent patterning. What have you guys seen with that sort of dynamic?
I've seen that. So I think the, emotional intelligence or mastering your emotions is about regulating your emotions. It's both about being able to understand what you're experiencing emotionally and keep it within a healthy range, and about being compassionate towards others, but not getting sucked into their emotions. So I would say that when you're almost diagnosing yourself with something by giving it a name, perhaps the boundary around compassion needs to be stronger.
Yeah, I completely agree. And something I've practiced now and am getting much better at, I think through neuroplasticity reinforcement, is even though I'm so sensitive and I take in, as somebody who identifies as this, the empathic codependent, which is probably the most debilitating of all, to be honest. And often I wish that I could just turn that off and not have it. My mom is a great example. She's far more empathic than I even am, but she doesn't give a shit what people think. So she's so lucky. But something I have been practicing a lot more recently, and it doesn't totally solve it, but it really helps. And it's part of that reinforcing in a conscious state, is that's not about me. That's them. That's their thing. And so that's been helping. And when I say that, it's certainly not a way to gaslight or to get out of something. I'm very aware of when I need to take responsibility, but it is that age old, like when you're pointing a finger at somebody else, 3 are pointed back at you. So the ones that are the hardest for me are rooms of people who are very unintegrated. And I don't mean to say that one is more so than the other, but I can feel it right away. It's palpable. And in LA, that's a very common thing. So I tend to avoid experiences or rooms where there are a lot of people. This used to be the case, certainly in acting, where there's a lot of desperation in a room. May it be to be seen, fame, needing to fill voids from youth. A lot of the things that I work on continually through this work to no longer have. But those are the most exhausting for me. However, when I'm in a room of people who have done quite a bit of work on themselves and they're incredibly integrated, that's a room that I have a lot less energetic leak in, and I can hold my own in. So when I do find myself in experiences that that people aren't integrated, I have to say, this isn't about me. It's okay. I'm not going to take in whatever, all of the things that are happening in the room. So that both lands on codependency in general, how you feel in a room when you were little. When I was little, I'll say, I was often having to shapeshift and change my energy at every different house in order to survive. Not that I wouldn't have survived, but in order to be loved and liked. And then putting the psychic energetic gifts on top of it, it's a very heightened experience whenever I'm around a group of people or in public experiences. And so that's been really, really helpful for me. And then, of course, if that isn't enough, I have to really go do a DI to be like, well, then there is something deeper here that I need to look at or take accountability on. So that's just a tiny little side note on that for me.
Well, I think it's actually really relevant to people who perhaps aren't aware of being psychic or an empath or aren't. All the research on social contagion, which shows that things like if the people you hang around with are obese, or if people that you spend most time with get divorced, that increases quite significantly your chances of putting on weight or your relationship ending. And it's not literally catching, but it's that becomes socially acceptable. And so if you are spending a lot of your time with people who value material things or sort of, shallow things, or care a lot about what other people think of them or say about them, you're more naturally going to be attuned to those things, even if it's not debilitating or you're not that aware of it. So I think it's an important message for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's such a helpful distinction too, because I think it's also when people are feeling others' energy or they're feeling fatigued by it, there are action steps you can take to sort of integrate your own self, beef up your own boundaries, or taking yourself out of a situation that might be too triggering or too elevating in that moment, like being around people who are at that sort of energetic level.
So I'm quickly interrupting this episode to invite you, if you're ready to start your manifestation journey, or if anything you've heard in our manifestation episodes has piqued your interest, to begin. We have a la carte workshops in everything from the basics bundle, which is what we recommend to everyone who starts. It's the formula that actually teaches you how to manifest, unblocked inner child, and unblocked shadow. We also have a la carte workshops on love and money. But the real gem is the Pathway membership, because it encompasses every single workshop we have. It's a year-long membership with full access to the few a la carte offerings we have and exclusive workshops not available anywhere else, such as the daily practice, which is what everybody in the Pathway uses, hopefully at least 3 times a week to daily, in order to truly create the new neural pathways that one needs in order to manifest, and houses the library of our deep imaginings, which is our unique hypnosis process that allows you to get into your subconscious and overwrite those old neural pathways, creating the new ones. We have Unblocked Boundaries, the up-level workshop that covers how to navigate a rut if you're in one, a rock bottom, or how to take things to the next level. And access to the community group where you can connect with over 12,000 other manifestors on this journey to find expanders, ask them how to navigate blocks you might be in, tests you might be receiving, and create community. You can use our special code, EXPANDED, all caps, EXPANDED, to receive $20 off your first a la carte workshop purchase, or $20 off your first month of the Pathway. Again, that's all caps, EXPANDED, EXPANDED. And do yourself a favor. As you know, if you've been listening to our manifestation episodes, 3 things have to be in motion to manifest: unblocking, expanding, and passing tests. The expanding portion is seeing to believe, showing your subconscious that what you want is possible through engaging, encountering with, or reading about, or watching what we call expanders. That's somebody you identify with who has gone on to manifest, is successful in, or inhabits what you want. And you can find on our homepage what's called the motivation. It's the testimonial library, where you will read thousands and you can pick the category that you're particularly manifesting, say money, career, love, travel, and so forth. And by reading those stories and going through their step-by-step experience, what they were calling in, what workshops they did to receive it, tests they passed, their magic darks, the expanders that they had to find, you are already creating space in your subconscious for your manifestation to come through. You can find that linked below or on our homepage under the Motivation Testimonial Library. Okay, now back to the episode.
So what are some examples of how codependency has presented in your life? Lacy, you've given us a ton so far, but I'm curious, what are some other ways and tools that you've used this work or other work? When someone's like, all right, great, I'm codependent, now what? What's sort of their next step? How can they start seeing the world through a new lens? Because I felt so much freedom when I realized that I was codependent and had codependent tendencies. And I think I actually listened to an older episode from you, Lacy, and you had mentioned CODA, which is Codependent Anonymous. And I went to a meeting in LA, and I was so interested by all the stories that were there and even just the education that they had online on their website. So just want to hear some of your guys' insight in a roundtable.
Yeah, I'll let you kick off first, Tara, from a clinical perspective of how to start to heal it.
I think most people need an example of something in their life that they've gone through that wasn't a great experience to really get that level of insight and awareness about changing it. And although it can be in all sorts of relationships, as Jessica said at the beginning, it really shows up in romantic relationships. And so if you're codependent and that would show up as things like trust issues and anxiety or hypervigilance about where this person is when they're not in your sight. And just, feeling like you couldn't live without them and that your whole life is centered around this relationship. Then if the relationship ends, it's a really, really traumatic experience. And not many people want to go through that twice. So that's usually a wake-up call for, what part did any of my, behavioral tendencies play in making this, the actual process of the breakup, so debilitating. There are some things that you can do to try to have a more interdependent relationship next time. And that, involves things like sometimes having some time to yourself, but not because you're so super independent that you don't need anyone, because that's actually being avoidant, but to understand, because we spend a lot of time saying, what do I want out of a relationship? And often codependent people will just go into a relationship because they don't want to be alone. So starting with understanding what you have to offer in a relationship is really important as well. I don't think we spend enough time on that. And then things like identifying what you like, what your taste is in terms of a home or clothes or books that you read and what matters to you, so that you don't slide into being like, oh, well, my partner's really into conservation, so that's going to become my thing now. That you have a strong sense of what you stand for and what's important to you. Being less afraid to ask for what you want or need in a relationship, whether it's romantic or friends and family. Spending time with a variety of people so that no one person, whether it's a friend or a partner, looms that important in your life because you're just spending a disproportionate amount of time with them. Making sure that you continue to pursue your own personal goals, even when you go into a relationship, and your hobbies and interests and things like that. So, a classic sign is that you used to do yoga twice a week, but then you started dating someone and you stopped doing the yoga, that kind of thing. Being really clear on what your values are, not afraid to say no if you don't like something or want something. And just maybe journaling or asking yourself if you're doing things or sort of, not letting your light shine so brightly because your goal is to please others, not so that they won't leave you, that kind of thing. So there are lots of really practical things you can do. And there are, lots of parts of the work, particularly child, shadow, and boundaries, that are really relevant to this.
Yeah, for me personally, and I think those are all fantastic, attainable, and very accessible tools to start to implement daily to shift. And for me, I have to say that as somebody who's still recovering, and personally, I don't do CODA anymore because I've found this work to actually super speed the recovery more so than CODA was. But I'm a very big fan of 12-step or any support group that's going to help any situation. Even listening as we're going through this episode of a lot of the things you've been reading, Jessica, about, somebody who is recovered or isn't identifying as a codependent or the opposite or interdependence. I'm like, wow, I've come a long way while I'm listening. But the thing that I just want to say is it's taken me a lot of time. I started the work of addressing these issues, namely inner child work, because that's where this stems from, shadow work, putting a lot of things in my shadow, moving from house to house, the whole survival thing, and then starting to work on boundaries. I started that all around 25. And then I really, really focused on it at 30, 36 now. So I just want to say that it's been over 10 or 11 years I've been really focused and working on this. So that's one thing I just want to tell anybody who identifies as this or identifies as strongly as maybe I do, that it takes time, number one. It's a lot of neuroplasticity shifting happening. And two, I think what helped me the most was when I started to identify as somebody who was empowered. So taking accountability rather than a victim. And I know that word has a lot of activation around it, victim. But for me, had I have kept staying in the space of this is happening to me, I wouldn't have been able to start to take control of my life. So I say that, and a part of empowerment means taking accountability for everything I'm feeling and experiencing. And then the third piece is literally doing this work or whatever form of inner child, shadow, and boundary work that somebody connects with. That has been what has allowed me to sit on this podcast today and go, wow, I've really come so far listening to this conversation. So I think a huge piece, if you're navigating this work as a codependent, may it be on either side of the spectrum we've been talking about, number one is really figuring out your authentic self and code. I mean, that's just step one, because most codependents don't have a basis for exactly who they are, because a lot of it's through the lens of somebody else, or a lot of it's through the lens of avoiding getting hurt or being abandoned. So that's number one. And if you're doing how to manifest when you start this work, you're going to learn that and get a glimpse of it. And then number two is, of course, inner child and shadow, and then working into boundaries. And repetition, as we always say, with heightened emotion, is how you're going to literally change your brain, the way that you subconsciously project and interact with the world, and conscious reinforcement. So that's the daily practice. Unfortunately, I mean, not unfortunately, I guess fortunately, if you do identify in any way, shape, or form as a codependent, you've come to the right place because our body of work really supports it, the healing of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's really interesting because, for my journey with this sort of dynamic, it presented in a lot of different ways, some pretty small that weren't that activating. I would have a hard time telling, old roommates when I wanted them to do their dishes more often. And that didn't seem like that big of a deal. But, over time, then you're holding on to resentments, and where you have resentments means that you have poor boundaries. And so I was like, okay, why am I not able to tell them that I'm annoyed with the dishes? And can I just say something? And so working through those triggers and working through the boundary work on that and being able to say, hey, I love when this place is clean. It makes me feel like my sanctuary. Would you mind doing them within a day or two of using them?
I would literally die as a Capricorn if it took a day or two for somebody to do their dishes. Oh. I'd be like, do you think you could do those within 30 minutes?
After you use, just rinse and put in the dishwasher. It's super easy and fun.
Super easy.
But understanding that dynamic and leaning into that surrender. And so those are kind of small ways where I had to figure out why can't I say this? Why am I trying to keep the peace? Why am I being avoidant here? And then other bigger ways, I think obviously a lot of our codependency stems from dynamics in childhood. So one for me is trying to caretake my mom. And so I just have this one vivid memory of she was visiting me out in LA, and we were driving on the PCH, and Daniel was driving and he was going fast, and I kept poking him to slow down a bit, and he's like, I'm not going that fast, like it's not a big deal. And I just kept thinking, I know my mom is nervous that we're going fast. She didn't say anything. She didn't do anything. She didn't even request he slow down. She didn't say anything about that. But in my gut, I was like, I know her, and I know she wants him to slow down. And in that moment, I was like, whoa, why am I projecting this onto her and now to Daniel? And now I'm getting nervous about it because I'm trying to caretake her needs. And so Daniel's like, Lisa, like, do you need me to slow down? And she's like, no, I'm totally fine. And so maybe she was, maybe she wasn't, I don't know. But I remember just thinking like, oh my gosh, I've got to unplug this unspoken caretaking that's occurring because I'm stressing Daniel out with it. I'm stressing myself out with it. And who knows if it's even true. Like, she's an adult. She can speak her needs if she needs, me to slow down or whatever it is. And so then looking at that dynamic, that's when I went to that one meeting. And I only went once to the CODA meeting, but just to be able to say, this is a problem and I'm going to look at it. And I'm not afraid of this title or name or saying that I'm having a challenge with this and working through it. It was almost like outing my shadow about it. So then I could be like, okay, cool, let's hit the ground running and really figure this thing out. Where are all the ways I'm doing this? Why am I doing this? And I think in healing it, it's about reprogramming those triggers to safety. Even if I'm alert that my mom wants someone to slow down in the car, she's responsible for herself, I'm responsible for myself, and I am still safe and loved, even though I don't take care of or look out for what I'm perceiving her emotions to be in that situation. And that's when things really started to shift, when I really owned that aspect.
And I think it's important to say that, as humans, we are wired to connect and be in friendships and relationships and families. So this isn't saying that, we should sort of have none of that, but it's when it starts to actually hinder your life and your relationships. So, but I also have to say that I have the kind of opposite example of the washing your dishes, which is that at some point my ex-husband's, when he was my husband, his cousin came to stay with us for a while. And I put like a dish in the sink that I was going to deal with a bit later. And he said, I can't tolerate any dishes left in the sink. I have to wash them straight away. And I said, yeah, you really shouldn't have told me that, because I'm now going to leave all the dishes in the sink knowing that they're going to get done by someone else. So, I think it's so great, for Lacy to say that she started this work at 25, because I think at 25 that I didn't know that I had any such issue. And I'd sort of gone from being a daddy's girl to meeting my first husband. And I was sort of like so in love. And it was kind of, my friends said things like, we feel like our love isn't even anything compared to like what you're experiencing. But of course, the crash at the end of that relationship was really debilitating. And I think I've shared before that because he did validate me so much, that when I was on my own, all of the sort of, low self-worth feelings really came up. But my therapist challenged me that they had been there before. I just hadn't noticed. So it wasn't all about the end of the relationship, but it certainly made me aware of it. So having then become aware of it more like in my mid-30s and working on it, I've definitely, in my second marriage that I'm in now, we've nurtured those interdependent qualities because we are both a bit codependent. And I sort of joke to my stepson that Dad and I are like the similar level of codependence, so it kind of works because we meet each other where we need to. But that's wrong. It should be about interdependence, not both being codependent, because there's often an enabler. So codependence isn't just about the person that wants to do all the caring. And, having been trained as a doctor and having heard Gabor Mate's research on how a lot of people that go into nursing and medicine and psychology have this deep need to look after others and care for others because they're carrying a wound of their own. I have noticed in the last year since we've been locked down that because there is that codependent element to both myself and my husband, that we've absolutely loved being locked up alone together for 24/7. And I actually said to one of my friends whose relationship had broken down in the last year that we will probably have an issue when we can't be together all the time. But I'm sort of proud of myself for being aware of that. And I'm going to try and preempt it by having little mini excursions away from each other before doing anything that's, too overwhelming.
I think that's such a good point you bring up about it's two people in the dynamic. And I think that's why the spectrum of codependency is so varied, because there's someone who gets nurtured in the dynamic and there's someone who is the nurturer in an unhealthy dynamic. And one of the things that the CODA organization had online, which was really interesting, was that the spectrum sort of falls into a series of patterns. So they had denial, where you have difficulty identifying your own feelings, like not understanding your authentic code, who you are authentically. You have low self-esteem. Compliance, where you're rejecting your own values or other people. You're hypervigilant. All these things can fall under compliance. Control, where you believe people are incapable of taking care of themselves, or you're persuading them to do the things that you want to do. And avoidant, trying to avoid emotional, physical intimacy, to feel vulnerable, indirect communication, passive aggressive, those sorts of things. So it is such a wide spectrum, and you can kind of move around depending upon the dynamic and who you're relating to. I think of like when you're in line at like the coffee shop and someone starts talking to you, like my inner self is like, oh God, please don't talk to me. I don't want to have a conversation right now. I just want to get my coffee and get out of here. And then seeing like, okay, how am I going to interact with the dynamic? Am I going to say, oh, I'm really not trying to talk right now if they don't really get the hint that I'm trying to have some alone time? Or am I going to engage in a really long, drawn out conversation that will continue on past the coffee shop because I'm not honoring my boundaries? It's kind of witnessing those little moments of, how am I going to show up for myself now? How can I honor my boundaries? How can I find balance between the two without just shutting someone out and putting my headphones in and ignoring them? How can I do that in an integrated way, in a way that feels respectful to myself and to others? And those moments are kind of like little blessings, because now you get to see, how can I fully show up as myself further, deeper in this situation, in that situation? It has all these opportunities.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about that example you give, because that's a day-to-day thing for a codependent, like day-to-day, myself, those are the areas that I struggle the most still. I'm the person who cleans the house before the housekeeper comes, which Max cannot stand, or I'm the person who will exhaust myself speaking to people out in public to the point of like having no energy left because I don't want to hurt their feelings walking away from the conversation. But I also see those as many little tests to step into your worth. And when I say step into your worth, it's exactly what you outlined, Jessica, being able to advocate for yourself. They're like tiny little opportunities of tests to be like, can you speak your needs? Can you set a boundary? Can you not need the validation of this person or situation? So they're wonderful opportunities, and it's a day-to-day struggle.
And then what about codependency showing up as our ego dance? Ego dance is something we talk about a lot in manifestation. So it's the inauthentic actions you take or ways you present yourself to put on a show for others in order to be accepted, loved, and liked. How do those dynamics kind of go hand in hand with codependency?
To me, they're the direct result of the wounds that created codependency, in my opinion. Certainly that's the case for me. A lot of my version of ego dancing was exactly what I learned to do young, to be loved in different environments.
And what about for you, Dr. Tara? How does that kind of ego dance show? Like, where do you find yourself ego dancing in the world?
I'm sure I do it a lot, but it actually really suddenly brought to my mind an example of a friend who, super intelligent, beautiful, had been in a very long-term relationship, like 9 or 10 years. And her partner was a passionate eco-warrior, almost so passionate that it was a bit off-putting for people. But anyway, they stopped all of their air travel, sold their car, had things at home like the compost thing that you worm with, had worms in it, and would try to grow things as much as possible. And then after they broke up and she rushed into another relationship, suddenly she was eating meat and flying all over the world. And I remember thinking, wow, I just remember being so shocked, realizing that the things that she was doing were because of the partner and completely changed when there was a different partner. So I'm not trying to avoid giving an example of my own, but that one really came to my mind as you were speaking as such an example of that. And I think maybe to add that this was something that I kind of started to see, that, you know, there's a pattern in the types of relationships that you get into or what you demand from those relationships. So I imagine that implicitly I demanded a lot of validation from my first husband because I needed that to feel good about myself. And so if you see that things like that repeat, because both parties are playing the ego dance, you know, the person who needs all that attention and is anxious, if the other person doesn't give them all the validation that they need, then the relationship actually can't last. So I think it's about seeing the patterns in the people that you have in your life. And I don't just mean romantic partners. It may be how you were like as a little girl with your father, and then what you see in other relationships, because we can be like that with friends. We can need them to tell us how well we're doing as well. So I think looking out for things like that. And, you know, when you do the DIs, I think that you go deep, because these things are deep. They're often subconscious. That is a great way to uncover, particularly if you follow up by journaling afterwards.
And I think the thing with codependency too is like, it is really scary to think about taking your energy back from a dynamic where you have helped to caretake someone. It feels terrifying because you feel like if they think that they can't depend on me in the way that they did before, then I won't be loved, I'll be rejected, our relationship will change, and I don't want that. It feels really, really scary. That's sort of the fear that kind of goes on. And if you can sort of reframe it to, I can love them so much better and we can have such a better relationship if I start to love myself first and put myself first, that's when things start to change. You know, a lot of times we don't want to change these dynamics because we're scared of the outcome. We're scared of rejection or losing this person. It's like, no, we're asking this person to accept a better version of ourselves, that we can actually help ourselves and them way better in the process.
And we have a good little bit about this in boundaries too, that the moment you do begin to shift the dynamic through advocating for yourself, we have this in boundaries where the shadow sometimes will most often present from the other party in person, but we have tools on how to navigate that. And just to kind of take that a little bit deeper, and not everybody's always in the space, but many of us get into relationships, and not just romantic. This can be career, it can be friendships, it can be all sorts of dynamics out of trauma bonding, right? Where each other's missing puzzle pieces of trauma. So the moment that you really do start to advocate for yourself and you do start to heal these patterns and step into your true authenticity and your worth, if you do end up parting or leaving or losing that experience, the far better version of what your soul wants anyways is going to fill that space. So that's just a hopeful note as well. If somebody's on the verge of an unhealthy experience and they're really going to do the work to step into their worth through boundaries and all of that good stuff, just know it's everything you need to do to create the magnetism to fill that space with something far more desirable for you.
Yeah, and I also think, building on what you've both said, that if you are the needy half of the codependent relationship, then, you know, unless being an enabler is satisfying that person's needs in some way, and, you know, relationships like that aren't sustainable, not in a healthy way anyway, it's actually quite exhausting for somebody to continually have to validate someone else to justify where they've been, what they're thinking, what they've done, how much they love the person. So if you think back to the episode where we talked about the stages of a romantic relationship, and we were really careful not to be too prescriptive about this, but we all know that the honeymoon stage doesn't last forever. So I'll go even further to say that if we don't do that work to make sure that we're not making such psychological demands on our partner, that could actually contribute to the end of the relationship because the other person can't do it anymore.
100%.
Agreed, completely.
So codependency also kind of crosses over with attachment styles, being anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, also crosses over with enmeshment. Are they all one and the same? My logistics brain is how do I categorize them all? How do you sort of see these different concepts?
I see them more as overlapping circles, like in a Venn diagram, than separately categorized. They kind of almost depend on each other to exist, if you know what I mean. So I should actually probably draw out that Venn diagram for you. But, enmeshment is a part of codependency. They're overlapping circles and people can actually move between those ways of being. So they're absolutely enmeshed. I don't think there's value in separating them because they're all so connected to each other.
I certainly, speaking for myself, I shapeshift between them. And a lot of it comes from enmeshment with my mom. Sleeping in the same bed with her until I was 11. Crazy, because she was a single mom, crazy stuff.
There's a lot of people that do that after a relationship breaks up or when a relationship's breaking down or they know that their partner's cheating, they bring their children into their bed. And I just don't think that people are aware enough of how damaging that's going to be for that child in future, where if they don't get that kind of bond with someone, they will just continuously think that something's wrong with the relationship.
Yeah, it's so interesting too, looking at especially the way my mom was raised, in an alcoholic household and 5 girls and a 3-bedroom house with the 2 parents. There was nothing but enmeshment in her upbringing. And of course, she had me at 19 that I think she tried to go an opposite direction. There was abuse in her house and all of that fun stuff. And she never once hit me. Back in the 80s, I think that was still a relatively new concept to not spank your kids. And so it's really interesting how she went from such an unhealthy experience in her childhood, didn't have the opportunity to do any healing or work, and then completely went the full opposite spectrum with me, where there was never any discipline whatsoever. I could do anything I wanted, no boundaries whatsoever. And so it's really been an interesting thing in my journey. And I think she's actually doing quite a bit of the work now herself to kind of unknowingly unravel some of that stuff, but of breaking those cycles, and I think that from what I know, from the communities I know of Irish Americans, that's not a very rare story. So it's just been really fascinating to look at that culturally, look at it as we move into more conscious spaces, just being in 2020. Yeah, it's all a really interesting conversation.
I think even to, we've been talking a lot about being the children and having concepts from our childhood, but then it's also thinking of the next generation. How do you parent? Obviously, at some point, you'll probably fuck up your kids, like you always say, Lacy, so that's just an inevitable piece. But how do you do it in a conscious way where you can at least try to not have that codependency relationship? And I think the key really is looking at the ways in which you're being codependent and healing those. And then that translates generationally. You're healing those wounds and those familial wounds and dynamics from so long ago that once you heal them, generations going forward can have a different dynamic presenting.
Yeah, I definitely know that's where my whole third wave is going to come. Like I said, I started at 25, got very serious at 30 when Max and I got in relationship together because we just really mirrored and showed each other where the work was there. And then I think this is going to be the ultimate mirror. I know it's going to be a road traveled, going through being a parent and seeing all of this come up in a whole different way that I can't even anticipate at this moment. But yeah, 100%.
But you're going to do it so well.
Thank you. Yeah. I sure hope.
How lucky. I think that's so cool, that you were aware of this work and doing this work since, the codependency even specifically, since 25. That's so impressive. I'm so interested to see what happens in future generations as people are doing the inside work, as they're becoming more self-actualized and taking, responsibility for their emotional states, and what impact that has on future children generations.
Amen.
I think I had a slightly easier version of what Lacy's about to go through. becoming a stepmother later in life and, to a young adult. And obviously having my psychological background. And I remember so many times saying to my husband, boundaries make children feel safe. Because if that, sometimes there's that fear, especially with divorced dads, of kind of doing or saying something, the child kind of not liking it. And the more I sort of got him to understand that and he could finally do it, it's just been amazing seeing my stepson blossom in the way that he has. And so I'm a really, really firm believer in that children really need boundaries. And actually, it's not that you're always saying no, it's you're making them feel safe.
Yeah, I learned that as a preschool teacher, and I had no concept of that before. You should see me with my dogs. There are no boundaries whatsoever. I mean, geez. But at the preschool, that was really hammered into me, and I got to see it in real time because it creates a structure for which they can be free in. And that was really insightful for me. Let's see if I remember any of it when she comes. And I'm sure, faced with my own child, it'll be much more difficult. But yeah, humongous. And for anybody out there, I've been doing a lot of research in Rye parenting. If anybody remembers Lila, she was raised Rye, and her aunt is actually Janet Lansbury. And so I've been, really looking into her work a lot. Lila turned out pretty good.
The sweetest.
The sweetest. I'm just trying to look at models that can help, that are very different from what's ingrained in me.
Love that. And just a quick closing exercise for anyone at home. If you're like, where do I start with all of this? How can I discover it? Start noticing some of the ways that you may be codependent or reliant on someone else's validation to make decisions for yourself, and start taking that through unblocked boundaries. So you can see places where you can better hold those boundaries, notice where you're not honoring your authentic needs. And if you're having trouble finding, where this might be presenting in your life, we'll have a link to kind of a long checklist of ways that it may be presenting, but also start looking at the places that you're feeling very resentful of others. That's usually a good indication that something's crossed a boundary, and likely it could be tied to some codependency. So thank you, Dr. Tara. Thank you, Lacy. Very educational episode. I'm sure will be very helpful for many. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And have a wonderful rest of your week, everyone. See you next time.
See you next week. Thank you so much for tuning into the episode, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, we did. And in case you're not totally ready to join the pathway yet, I wanted to share a few of our free offerings that I'll often suggest to people as a little bit of a blueprint to get them started on their manifestation journey. The first place I like to direct people completely for free is the motivation. You can see it linked below or on our homepage as our testimony library. And it's categorized by different subjects, whether you're calling in career, money, love, wellness, and much more. When you're reading about a member's experience of what they manifested, you're actually seeing to believe and showing your subconscious that that very thing is possible for you. The second place I like to direct people is to the free clarity exercise, which is also linked below. In it, you get to try our own unique hypnosis process, learn about the science, and some journaling prompts. And the best part about this, you'll get a tiny taste of what it's like to go into your hypnotic state, bring your subconscious forward, and create new neural pathways while receiving clarity. And the third thing, if you haven't listened to it on this podcast yet, please go back to the episode titled Manifestation 101, where you'll learn the basics of neural manifestation to truly understand this process. So go ahead and check out those free resources, the motivation, the free clarity exercise, and the episode Manifestation 101, all linked below. And in an effort to make sure to have representation in this process series, go ahead and submit any process testimonials you have, especially to our LGBTQ+ community, our BIPOC, as well as the Ys, which is anyone in the community who is 45 and over. All right, we'll be back next week.